have this sort of false bifurcation of us and we're safe, and then there's them and they're unsafe. When in reality, we know from statistics, from lived experiences, that abuse happens in church, and it happens a lot in church. There was, I think the statistic from Darkness to Light is 90% of kids know and have what they would consider to be a loving relationship with their abuser. So it's not this is the safe space, and we need to fortify it to protect against outsiders. The reality is that these challenges of safety are very much an internal thing, and certainly the dynamics that enable abuse and exploitation are certainly do exist, unfortunately, in every faith community.
And how that helped me in my healing was God understood that for a period of time I hated God, I hated the church. If this was the kind of God that allowed these types of things to happen, I didn't want anything to do with it. And guess what? God's big enough and tough enough to handle me hating him.
Do you value people over institutions, or institutions over people? It's critical. Christ didn't die to save 501c3s. He didn't. Christ died to save people. And so are your actions in the during phase, are they going to reflect that? Do they reflect a concern for people over 501c3 status, over operating fund reserves? What are your priorities? What are your values? Live out those values through.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to our conversation on creating safety in our faith communities. This is part of the first part of a 6-part series that we're going to be doing on trauma-informed principles. So these 6 trauma-informed principles that we're going to be talking about include safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and being able to address the historical, cultural, and gender factors associated with abuse and trauma. These are central to really equipping churches to do a better job of recognizing, preventing, and responding to abuse. And that is the heart of Grace's mission, equipping Christian faith communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. So I'm glad that you can join us today for the first part of this conversation. Before we get into our conversation, I want to bring your attention to an upcoming event that will be April 26th and 27th. Called Keeping Faith. It's a 2-day conference that Grace helps to host along with the Zero Abuse Project and others. It's 2 days, it's available virtually, and it's focused on the intersection of child abuse and our faith. So if you have any interest in participating with that, it would be great to see you there. Victor Veith, if any of you have seen him, you would know that he's absolutely amazing. He's the primary presenter, and then I do some presenting, as well as Allison Fay, who's the director of the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, and some of you may remember that she was a guest on our program a few months back. You can go to zeroabuseproject.org to register if you are interested in attending that, coming up on April 26th and 27th. For today, our topic is safety, and we are honored to have a couple of people that I consider friends, and a couple of people that know so much about this topic of how can we create safety in our faith communities. Robert Peters and David Pittman are joining us today. They bring an incredible amount of experience, an incredible amount of expertise, an incredible amount of wisdom that I just could not do justice to. So I'll let you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves if you want to let us know who you are.
Hey guys, I appreciate being here. I'm David Pittman. I'm the director of Together We Heal, and I'm also part of the Child Safeguarding Initiative with Grace, where we teach and train churches.
And good afternoon, at least in Virginia, though I see we've got folks tuning in from just about everywhere. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Robert Peters. I'm senior attorney with the Zero Abuse Project, founder of Shield Task Force, which is an abuse prevention nonprofit. And in another life, pre-pandemic, was a prosecutor. Now I work training prosecutors, law enforcement on effective responses to abuse. Great to be with you. Great to be with Pete and David.
Awesome. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today. As we go through our conversation, please be aware that the last 15 minutes or so are going to be dedicated to questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section. You can click on that at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many as we can with the last 15 minutes or so of our time together today. This will be recorded. This will be put on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to access it later. So please definitely access it later. Let friends know that it's there, or others know that it's there as an ongoing resource. As we get into our conversation today, the discussion that we want is to start looking at safety. How do we create safety within our churches, within ministries? Safety from a prevention standpoint, but safety also from a response standpoint. How do we actually create an environment that is safe for a person to come forward, if whether in this environment or some other place, they have experienced some form of abuse? But when we say safety, not everybody defines it the same way. So I guess, first off, I'm wondering if you guys can help us out. What is safety?
So something that you and I have talked about before, Pete, is there is no such thing, right? There's no such thing as a safe neighborhood, a safe church. It doesn't exist. But what we can and what we do strive to do is to create a safer environment, right? And that's what we're going to do. Because for the folks who don't know my story, I was sexually abused and raped by a youth minister at my church from the time I was 12 till I was 15. So because of that, I didn't feel safe in a church for over 25 years, period. I mean, I went to a wedding or a funeral and I was out of there as fast as I could go. And not feeling safe in that environment. So when you say who creates or who defines, a person who's been victimized needs to be the one first to define that. They've got to be in control of that. They've got to be given control, I should say, of that. Because until they feel safe in themselves, it doesn't matter what programs or those sorts of things that are out there. So helping a victim or a survivor be able to feel safer, I think that's going to be a big step in that.
Yeah, it's really well said, David. There's so much that we could touch on there, and maybe spend probably this whole Zoom experience just on this question. I think a few points I'd focus on within churches. I love that insight that there's not a truly safe space. And I think sometimes within churches, at least within my tradition, which is more in the American evangelical strand, sometimes we have this sort of false bifurcation of us and we're safe, and then there's them and they're unsafe. When in reality, we know from statistics, from lived experiences, that abuse happens in church, and it happens a lot in church. There was I think the statistic from Darkness to Light is 90% of kids know and have what they would consider to be a loving relationship with their abuser. So it's not this is the safe space and we need to fortify it to protect against outsiders. The reality is that these challenges of safety are very much an internal thing. And certainly the dynamics that enable abuse and exploitation are certainly do exist, unfortunately, in every faith community.
That's super important to recognize, that it's not just safety from the outside, that it's safety from within as well. Yeah, because having a misunderstanding of that, and our efforts become totally misguided, and whatever we're doing won't have the effect that it needs to have if we're trying to protect ourselves from the wrong thing.
And then so the second part of that to me would be, so you've got the person themselves, and then the organization, whether it's a school or it's a church, a faith community, actually putting into action things that will make it safer. The example I can give, my wife and I belong to a little Episcopal parish here in Jensen Beach. And a few years ago, I can't tell you which because COVID has blocked me from understanding how many years ago it was. But a few years ago, the priest at the senior priest at our parish called me and he said, "Look, we use a company called Presidium, and they do. It's mandated in all of the Episcopal and Anglican churches that they do this training, but it's videos and it's multiple choice. What you've explained to me, what you do with Grace, I want something more like that. We've already gotten approval. Will you come in and teach us?" I mean, I was blown away. So, we sure enough, we did the Grace training. And then a year and a half, again, who knows how long it was, but a long period of time goes by. And this priest is now retiring. And we go into the evening, it's a big thing, everybody's there. And I had noticed a little girl go kind of flash by my peripheral that I was having a conversation with somebody. And listen to me, I'm the one doing the training and I'm not paying attention. And just a couple of seconds later, one of the women in the church who was at the training comes up to me and she says, "Do you know that little girl? And did you know that this door over here was unlocked?" And so she goes and gets another minister there. They find the girl, they lock this door that had been unsecured. And she walks up to me and she says, "I just want to thank you that you made us aware of certain things to be aware," right? And every time I appreciate being able to share that story that's putting information and education into practice to create a safer environment. That's all, man, that's all we can ask for, right?
Yeah. And that's a good description of just a concrete thing. You were able to bring knowledge, and because you brought knowledge, they were able to apply that, and they were able to create some physical safety. Physical safety is incredibly important. What about other forms of safety? What about spiritual safety? What about emotional safety? What do those look like?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about safety writ large, we're looking at all those different dimensions. And I think if I had to sort of condense it into a definition, I would put safety as the holistic prioritization for an individual's needs across those different dimensions. So the physical, the emotional, you mentioned the psychological, spiritual as well, and prioritizing each of those. And I think within Christian faith communities especially, that could be articulated as a thoughtful manifestation of Christ's love for the individual across all their spectrums of being. And so spiritual is part of it. I think there's a lot of historical reasons why there's opposition to that spiritual safety piece in particular, but the ability to question, the ability to wrestle and get angry. And it's interesting because there's so much fierce pushback when we see someone who's asking those difficult questions. Even if they're raising the questions in an acceptable way, whatever that is, you see a lot of pushback oftentimes from religious entities. And it's so curious because you see it all throughout scripture, right? The psalmist being the obvious example. This is someone who's after God's own heart, and he's asking, how long? How long are you going to let the wicked trample the innocent? How long are you going to let all these atrocities happen? Why are you sitting where you're sitting and doing nothing to intervene here? And these are the same questions we ask as survivors and as professionals. So clearly, God was okay with David doing that. God wasn't threatened by that. And perhaps we shouldn't be as well.
Wow. That's important. Just that freedom to question, to say, I don't get this. It makes no sense to me. And have it be okay that that's where you're at. I think that brings in both the spiritual side to raise those questions about God, and that emotional, that psychological side, too, of just, you know what? I'm still anxious. I'm still angry. I'm still sad. I still feel loss. I want some revenge, whatever the emotion might be, to recognize that that's legitimate, that that's safe to have, that it's okay to be there and not be under judgment because that's what you feel.
That's a huge thing for me and fellow survivors. Robert, I understand you are too. Is not diminishing our feelings. One of the analogies I use is it's from the book of Revelation, so I don't have nothing to do with the prophecy and all that, but there's just one verse about, I would rather you be hot or cold, but not lukewarm. And how that helped me in my healing was God understood that for a period of time, I hated God, I hated the church. If this was the kind of God that allowed these types of things to happen, I didn't want anything to do with it. And guess what? God's big enough and tough enough to handle me hating him, right? But he also knew that's the hot or cold thing, right? I hadn't I hadn't become apathetic to God. I was still just, there was still fire there, but it was coming from pain. And God knew that. And he knew that if I could get to the point, it's right, because God doesn't force us about anything. But if I could get to the point and understood that God was with me when those things happened, right? And it broke his heart because he had to watch his child being harmed. And that was how I came to understand that God didn't want this to happen to me. He didn't allow this to happen to me. Free will allowed a perpetrator to harm a child. And so once I understood that, that was where I started feeling safer with God again.
Yeah, I appreciate that, David. That's really helpful. I think it ties into some of the spiritual safety piece as well, because as institutions, as faith leaders, one way to implement that spiritual safety piece is not mandating this is the spiritual lesson you should take from this, or this is the timetable in which you should learn this spiritual lesson, right?
You have to forgive right now.
Yes. Yeah, that's probably the most prevalent one. Yeah, and it's different for everyone. Different individuals will reach different conclusions. And I think part of that spiritual safety is allowing for that process to happen, and for really allowing for the work of God to look different in individual lives as it does, and not sort of mandating those timelines, particularly in a way that's not ensuring the safety, not just in the spiritual sense, but also the psychological and emotional sense.
That's a great discussion of safety in all of these levels. I think sometimes there is a little bit of a tendency. I know I have this tendency. I know other people who have this tendency as well. To go about and to do everything that I think I can to make a situation safe. And then since I've done everything I think I can to make it safe, I decide it must be safe for other people. But am I the one who gets to define whether it's safe for somebody? Who gets to define whether or not safety is there? Who gets to define whether or not it's safe to bring up questions and doubts? Who gets to define whether or not it's safe to reveal what has happened, to share those things? Who gets to define that?
I would start, Pete, with those who know what it is, those who know what safety is and know what it isn't. And that's the individual survivor, because that's going to look different from individual to individual. Without seeking to use too polarized of an example, I think recently of a headline where an individual was objecting to various things going on just in their local schools or whatnot, and concluded that a particular issue, a particular problem didn't exist. And the individual who was making that objection did not come from the culture where he would even know that that was the case, right? And so I think we see that in our broader culture in a variety of ways. Likewise, if you're not in that position, if you haven't had those abusive experiences, it's the height of arrogance, but it's also the height of ignorance to insist that, oh, this is safe or it isn't safe, because you don't have that radar developed. And I think even if you are a survivor, our experiences of abuse is different. There's a lot of literature talking about how perpetration on male victims and male survivors, and as David said, certainly that's my experience as well. That's different from abusive experiences of female survivors. Not better or worse, just different. And so I think allowing just being teachable in terms of what safety might look like from person to person, from survivor to survivor, but ultimately deferring to survivors as the experts on what safety is or what safety isn't. We can't simply conclude, oh, it didn't happen to me, so I must be safe. Most abuse isn't reported. Most abuse isn't reported overwhelmingly. It's the least reported crime. So it's the norm, and we're often not having it on our radar. So I think critical for that to be defined by those who it affects ultimately.
And I think, Robert, you just said a key word in there was deferring, right? If leaders don't have any experience, right? If they haven't been victimized, whether as children or even as adults in other ways, in abusive ways, but if they have no personal experience, then they must defer to those that have. When you call on someone like Grace, you can know, and I'm not trying to make that sound like a commercial, I'm just giving this, that's my life experience, right? I know at Grace, we have people who are working from that vantage point, if you can even call it that, right? We have that life experience. Or even the ones that don't understand, they understand relying on those. And so if you've got an organization and there's nobody, let's say they've established a committee, right? A committee on committees, and no one in there has any experience with it, then how is it going to be successful in creating anything of a safer environment?
Yeah, that's so important to hear the perspective of survivors. And if we don't, I think the term that I heard, arrogance and ignorance. It's the epitome of arrogance and ignorance. And I think that's powerful.
Yeah, and I think we could throw out numerous examples, but I think one trend that we could point to that exemplifies that is some of the discussion that's happened in some circles on the sin of empathy. This argument that it is a sin to empathize with others, and the argument goes like, I, the objective, religious leader, I'm outside of the quicksand, and so I can't enter into this quicksand with you, the person who suffered trauma, because when I do that, I lose my objectivity. And so that exemplifies arrogance and ignorance, because on the arrogant side, it's arrogance to not recognize your own quicksand, your own context, what you're currently swimming in and sinking in. So assuming your objectivity, it's arrogant, but it's also false. There was an article, Pete, I might have even seen it on your timeline, called Power Causes Brain Damage. It was interesting. It was reviewing these different studies on the social inabilities of those who acquired power. These studies just comparing different activities, some of them banal, but just as a silly example, those who had power, it was harder for them to write an E on their forehead such that other people could read it. They naturally wrote it so they could see it, not the other person could see it, right? So you're not recognizing your own quicksand when you think, oh, I'm up here on this objective standpoint. And to the extent there is a quicksand, I would argue leaders are probably more susceptible to it, as I think some of those studies hint at it. The other thing I would say, and again, I'm going a lot, I think I'm safe in throwing out different scriptural anecdotes, but the other thing I would say is that's not Christian, right? Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Was Jesus stepping into the quicksand outside of his objectivity when he connected with those individuals? ultimately, I mean, not only did he do that, but he was crucified. He became sin. He who knew no sin became sin, stepping into that experience. So the idea that we couldn't, or that we shouldn't empathize or keep ourselves, untainted by the brutality of life, it's not loving. It's not effective, and ultimately it's not Christ-like. And if we extrapolate this further, institutions are sinking into quicksand. Church institutions are sinking into quicksand. Everywhere you look, just follow the headlines. And so ultimately, church institutions need survivors to pull them out of the quicksand, and not vice versa.
Very powerful.
Robert, I think you said this when we were talking before. Churches need survivors more than survivors need churches. And I thought that was powerful.
Oh,
Just wanted to credit it to you.
I appreciate it.
Incredibly powerful. And it's a recognition of the humility that leadership in the faith community must display if this is ever to get better. Essential. That's powerful. So if the person, the survivor, is the one who has the biggest say in defining safety, in saying whether or not they feel safe here, what if the person can't define that? Either because of age, because of ability levels, because of experience or some other factor, they're not able to advocate or speak up or even identify their own sense of safety. What then?
So it's going to be on us, right? So with the period of time before I was able to find my voice, I needed someone to advocate for me. So at that point, it's got to be everyone else around. We have to be the ones to advocate, and we have to do it right. It's about so I'll go back to, again, my little my little work bubble. Running a background check won't mean diddly squat. Yes, it is a basic mandatory minimum. You have to start there. But 99.9% of the time, it's not going to catch anyone who's an actual predator. So if this person can't speak up for themselves, you've got to go further. I just made my little notes here so I can make sure I read them here. Right? We've got to educate. We have to establish boundaries. In other words, establishing policies. We've got to set up a place where it's about prevention and response to both the victims and the predators. But we have to get in a mindset that we've got to go beyond background checks. That's how I like to put it. It's beyond background checks. There's so much more work that has to be done to advocate for those who can't speak for themselves yet, who haven't found their voice. If we can't do that, if we can't learn how to talk to our kids about sexual abuse, how to learn how to, and I mean, when I say talk to kids, I mean normalizing that conversation from the day they're born. We normalize all other conversations, right? When your kid walks in the door, you ask them, "Hey, how was your day? Did you take that test? Did you write?" You go all through. Those are the normal conversations. That's what I mean by that. Part of that, those questions should be, did anybody make you feel uncomfortable today? When you start to normalize that conversation, then your kids aren't going to go, "What? What are you talking?" They understand. You've educated them. That's how you're being able to be their advocate. Anyway, that's just a couple of start things. Robert, you want to jump in on a couple of them?
Yeah. There's so much. There's so much out there. I love that general frame, and I think this goes to something that we're circling around and we'll address more explicitly later on. Is it's not this issue of policies; it's an issue of culture fundamentally. And I think in terms, I think the background check is a really good example, David, of the difference between a child protection policy and a risk mitigation policy. two very, very different things, right? The risk mitigation is, okay, let's check the little legal boxes, right? Let's have the background check and whatnot. Child protection policy is much more holistic. It's not written by an insurance company. It's not written by someone who has a financial stake in it. It's written by those that are committed to what child protection looks like in their special individualized context. And I think, David's work and others' work with the Grace Safeguarding Initiative is a great example of that. Not a commercial. I get no kickbacks, but it's a great thing to do, to proactively think of what does this look like. And I think circling to the question of, this issue of those who can't articulate it, that's most people. That's most people, for one reason or another, can't articulate or are unable to articulate what occurred to them, or are unwilling to, for a host of very understandable reasons. That's most people. 20% of individuals who attend churches are victims of abuse. Of sexual abuse, and it's broader when you include all forms of abuse. So most people in your church context, pastors and other leaders, do have that trauma background and aren't able or willing to talk about it. So how do you create that culture that enables you to do so? I would maybe liken it to some of my work as a prosecutor in courtroom accommodation motions. Those who care about this work, who are prosecutors, aren't going to throw a child onto a witness stand without having prepared them for that, without having tried to create an environment within that courtroom that's not a trauma-informed space, let's be honest, but you try to create as much of that space as you possibly can. And so one of the biggest ways to do that is to shut up and listen, and to hear what the needs are in the first place. When you talk about these issues as a culture, if you haven't done that, you'll be amazed at how many individuals come forward to talk about it. Every time I've given one of these talks or addressed this topic in a faith community, every time there's been some sort of disclosure, including for people that have never talked about it before. I think of, church attendees, a lady who came up that was 65 years old, never disclosed to anyone. When they know you'll listen, then you tend to hear these disclosures, when they know you'll listen and genuinely hear them. And so one way is simply normalizing the language. David gave the important example of normalizing that language with children. Also normalize that language within the broader faith community. When you do that, it pushes back against some of those forms of silence. And so going back to my courtroom accommodation motion, when I was working with children and preparing them for this awful experience, I'm asking about individuals they'd be comfortable with in the courtroom. I'd be asking for support individuals that they would want to have present. Sometimes that would be mom, dad, therapist. Sometimes that would be the big biker against child abuse. It just depended. So safety looked different to different kids. Sometimes it was mom. Sometimes it was dog the biker, who's 6'9", tats, beard down to his waist, terrifying human being, right? But that he was a very safe individual in the courtroom. The child felt extremely safe and did an incredible job. So I say that to say safety to some extent has to be customized person to person within faith communities. And I think that's a broader reflection of this cultural piece, not this check the box approach.
And so going back to that, I love that example about it being personal, right? That's what we do at every church. We're not there to change their theology. We're not there to change their these days politics. We're there to help protect children and to better identify predatory behavior. And we go through all these things. We give them all this information about grooming, right? These predatory tactics. But then I'm also very quick to say, this isn't about making you think there's a devil under every rock, right? That's about, because that's evil and paranoia, and that's the tools of evil. What we're doing is giving information so that you can establish boundaries and guidelines. It's like driver's ed for your kids, right? You give them these informations, you teach them the sidelines of the road, as it were. Is it to make them be fearful when they get on the road? Although in some roads it is kind of fearful, but that's not what it's about, right? You're giving them a way to better arm themselves. And that's exactly what we do when we're talking about policies and predatory behavior and all of this really scary information. It can be scary at times. It's so that it isn't scary when you actually get in the moment. Because again, as Robert alluded to, 20% 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 6, or 1 in 4, depending on your numbers, 1 in 3 to 1 in 6 for boys and girls. That's 20% of every single church population, because it is across the line socioeconomic. Doesn't mean if it's a rural Amish church in Ohio, which I've been to and helped teach, or the big city in New York, it's all the same.
Yeah. And we have to make sure that the steps that we take to try and create a safer environment are universal as well. And universal takes in different times, different settings. And I'm wondering if each of you could speak a little bit to that, to give us just a couple of practical things that a faith community can do to enhance safety, one, before an event occurs. So prevention type stuff. 2, during, in the heat of it. So when that person first comes forward with an allegation, first comes forward to reveal what has happened. And then after the fact, when a person is thinking about coming forward, maybe years after the abuse that has occurred, maybe it's abuse that occurred in a totally different environment, but they're thinking about bringing it to a church leader, to a small group, whatever it might be. What can our faith communities practically, a couple of examples, before, during, and after?
I don't remember who's supposed to start.
That was you, David.
I didn't remember either, to be fair.
Well, we were having a good conversation, so it totally escaped me. So, all right. Before, you've got to develop a written safeguarding policy. It doesn't have to be just about children. A written safeguarding policy, something that is absolutely substantial, that you can hold in your hand. It doesn't have to be a 400-page thing like that. It can be 4 or 5 pages of very succinct, this is what we want to do. These are the bare minimums to better keep our children and our congregants safer. That absolutely would be, because that gives you then the ability to say when you see something, right? So this was in our policy, like we talked about with the priest, or with the young lady at our church. She remembered about, oh yeah, these doors are locked, and if that's locked, then someone from the outside or someone from the inside can't take this child outside to harm them. So that to me is one of the biggest, is to have it in black and white.
Here's a great resource if you're thinking about putting together a policy. This is the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide. I think Zane mentioned it earlier. It's by Boz Chividjian and Shira Berkovitz. Shira's with Sacred Spaces, another unbelievable organization. Boz and Shira were on a few months ago talking about developing policy, and you can find that video on our YouTube channel if you wanted to check that out, as well as through our Facebook page. Policy, super important.
So then, do you want me to go answer each one of those? You would kind of go back and forth.
That sounds good.
So in the moment, there's only one thing. Here's the response that every human being should say when someone comes to them. I believe you. I'll support you in any way I can. That's it. There's nothing. It's not some. there's not some magical mystical potion to it. That's all you need to do. Let them know they are believed, and that you will do whatever you can to help. Because in most cases, most people aren't equipped to actually help this person, other than to get them to someone that can. Mm-hmm. And so that would be kind of a part 1 and part 2 of this, is know some resources in your area. Because we do that too at the training. We talk to whether it's a child advocacy center, whether it's trauma-informed therapists that are in their area. And that is what is most important. They must have actual trauma-informed training. It's not something that they just did recently. You want to ask that therapist, how long have they had been trauma-informed care? Ask them some tough questions so you can find out that they actually do have experience. So have those resources available to someone. Tell them you believe them, mean it when you say it, and then have resources available to them. And then I'll say I had the last one was, so after the fact. I don't know, let me think on that. Robert, you want to jump in on those first two and I'll be thinking?
Yes. Yeah. So what I like about what you just said, David, and Pete, the way the question is framed with that before piece is because that before piece is critical to a decent response in the during. You can't ignore this issue, or at least it's very difficult to ignore this issue and then respond with excellence in the heat of the moment if you don't have that context and those access to resources. So there's a host of places you can go. Pete just highlighted that great resource from Boz, Chavijit, and Sheer Berkovitz on the Child Safeguarding Policy Guide for Churches and Ministries. I previously shamelessly plugged Grace's Safeguarding Initiative. Pete's spoken a couple times at Zero Abuse Project's training called Keeping Faith. And what I like about that is you actually work through a couple hypotheticals of what happens. Child makes sex disclosure. This is the individual who comes in. How do you handle this issue of sex offenders, known sex offenders? And I know those are topics that David and others deal with through the Safeguarding Initiative as well. So grappling with those issues before they occur, or rather before you know they occur, let's make that critical distinction, is critical to an effective and to a decent response. The other thing I would say on the before side is think about the structural implications of abuse. Those of you, well, I guess many of us in more of the evangelical tradition, you sort of think of the three sources of evil in the world, and this is probably applicable beyond the evangelical tradition, but it's the world, the flesh, and the devil, right? I was reading a book recently that talked about how throughout Christian history, we've hyper-focused on the flesh. We're really focused on the individual sin, the flesh sin, and the book made the argument that the world and the devil have gotten off scot-free. And it talks about how this evil isn't just this individual issue, it's the systemic issue, it's the structural issue, it's baked into our systems, it's baked into our structures. So I think it's a worthwhile question. If evil is manifested not just in individuals, but also in systems, as I think you can pull verses and references in support, what does that suggest for your church's organizational structure? What does it suggest for ways in which your structure can effectively deal with the evil of abuse? So one easy place to go would be a child protection committee. Building child protection into the structure of your organization. And that committee should include representation from survivors, church leadership. So this isn't just a placatory committee to, hopefully acquiesce and tone down, the temperature. This is something that's meaningful, that's going to be proposing recommendations for making your church safer and addressing different risks. And it's something that it's a body its recommendations will be taken seriously. It's not just a token group, it's something that's actually meaningful and embedded into the structure of your church organization. Another critical piece I think to have on that child protection committee, in addition to survivors, is law enforcement. And not just any law enforcement. It needs to be specialized law enforcement that have actually dealt with these issues. It's a huge difference between someone who's investigated internet crimes against children for 20 plus years and someone who worked patrol. I've worked with patrol as a prosecutor, love those individuals. They shouldn't be the ones advising child protection policies if they haven't developed that specialization. So you really want someone who can bring that to bear. So that's the before piece. You have to grapple with all those complicated issues. That enables you to have a structure and a framework and resources to engage well with the during piece of when a disclosure occurs. And so in terms of some ideas on increasing safety during the during piece, one thing I would say is know your values. Know your values. And this is why that before work is so important. Do you value people over institutions or institutions over people? It's critical. Christ didn't die to save 501c3s. He didn't. Christ died to save people. And so are your actions in the during phase, are they going to reflect that? Do they reflect a concern for people over 501c3 status, over operating fund reserves? What are your priorities? What are your values? Live out those values during that phase, sacrificially prioritizing their safety. And that means reporting abuse and surrounding them with a community of support. It also means not being risk averse in terms of that reporting decision. At the end of the day, you don't need concrete evidence of abuse to report abuse. In most jurisdictions, you only need reasonable suspicion. And I'm not your attorney, I'm an attorney, but in most jurisdictions, you only need reasonable suspicion to report abuse. And it's critical. It's not saying I hereby, accuse this individual. It's saying I have a reasonable suspicion, and I think the individuals involved should get a referral to support and to assistance. So that's the during piece. In the after piece, there's so much that could be said. I think it's definitely critical to grapple with these issues on what went wrong. If there's something that happened in the church or something that maybe could have been prevented through some policies, not sweeping that under the rug, but meaningfully grappling with what went wrong. How do we make this never happen again? That transparency piece is critical. That honesty piece is critical. No minimization, no pretense that everything is fine. There is this false impression that's out there it's propagated by the media, it's propagated by many in religious leadership, that this survivors are just litigious and they're looking for lawsuits and they're looking for funds or whatnot. I have never met a survivor that's the case. Across working with hundreds, I've never met a survivor that met that straw man characterization. When I see survivors pursuing litigation, it's because they had no other choice to protect other individuals in that situation, because the leadership was not responding at any other level, and they tried and they went through it. They were ignored, they were marginalized, they were harassed, and so they had no other choice to keep kids safe in those entities. And so that after piece should be reflective. It should be in a posture of learning, not in a posture of defensiveness.
Bringing
Totally
us back
agree with
to
that, Robert.
humility. Sorry, go ahead, David.
I totally agree with you on that, Robert. That while you were talking, I was actually writing what could we have done better, right? And that's yeah. I'm sorry. I just want to make sure you heard another voice say yes. Go ahead.
Awesome. Well, we've covered a lot of ground for sure, and we've gotten a few questions come in. So at this point, I want to transition to answering some of those questions that have come in during our conversation. Before doing that, I want to mention, just encourage you all to check out both David and Robert, the work that they do apart from their time here today. David runs an incredible organization called Together We Heal. Please make sure to explore them and the work that they do. And Robert runs an organization called the Shield Task Force, and also does a lot of work, works full-time with the Zero Abuse Project. So please check out both of those organizations as well, organizations that we are honored to stand beside in this work to protect kids and protect adults, to keep our faith communities safe. So we have a couple of questions. Where do you advise the church or community to keep the documents, like the policy and such? How accessible should they be? Is it possible that someone could use them to circumvent the guidelines, to make it easier to abuse if they know what all the guidelines are?
Well, certainly predators are always going to be doing that. I mean, that sounds more like an excuse for why not to do a policy than oh, don't let perfection be the enemy of good, right? Isn't that the old saying? No, I don't buy that excuse. Thank you very much. Do a policy, do it the best you can, and always be adapting. A policy 10 years ago wouldn't include social media, or maybe 15 years ago now, wouldn't include social media. You would have changed the policy to update that. So, and we that's one of the things we instruct. Always look how you can make the policy better. So, yeah, I just wanted to chime in on that part.
Yeah, I echo that. And I think actually, David, what you just said about the policy piece is critical because of what we know about offender psychology. If you're putting them on notice, if that public policy is public, it's displayed, if you put them on notice, what do we know about predators? I mean, they're looking for target-rich environments, they're looking to abuse, and they're looking to get away with abuse. If you have a public
the path
policy,
of least resistance.
yes, absolutely. And so if you have a policy that's public that states these are the different frameworks or whatnot, and it's a strong policy, that has a potential deterrent effect on offenders. As David mentioned, we know they're manipulative. We know they're looking for any way they can possibly skirt it. But that goes to the importance, as David said, of a good policy, not having a policy which allows that manipulation to flourish and proliferate.
All right, great. Another question. How do you convince leaders who don't have personal experience with abuse that they ought to defer to survivors in order to understand what is safe? What if the leaders don't agree? What if they don't believe they're being arrogant? What if they believe that they're really doing the right thing?
Find another church. Seriously, I'm not being facetious, and I am not being a smart aleck, as my granny would have called me. If you are seriously at a church that is cemented in and unwavering and unwilling, then I would say find another church, because there are churches who do believe victims, who do support them, who do advocate for the vulnerable. I'm giving you an example of one, so I know of at least one. We helped hundreds of churches, right? We helped them, and of all denominations, of all faiths. It's not just those in Christianity. You met what's the gal that wrote
Shira with Sacred Spaces.
Thank you. Right. So that's with the Jewish faith, and so because this is across the board, right? If that leader truly doesn't believe that 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys, if they truly don't believe that, then they aren't understanding the actual gospel of protecting the vulnerable. And that's not a church that I would ever feel safe in.
That's well said. There's a similar piece that Victor Veith, one of Grace's board members, also a chief program officer at Zero Abuse Project, talks about. He has a book called On This Rock, Call to Center the Christian Response to Abuse on the Words and Actions, maybe? I forget the full title, the subtitle of
Teachings.
Christ. Teachings, there we go, and Teachings of Christ. And what he just said and what David just said are that child protection is central to the Christian faith. It's central to the Christian faith. When you look at the way that Christ prioritized children, the vulnerable, and if you have a leadership that doesn't get that, they don't get the gospel.
Yeah, powerful. This is not a side issue. This is central to the gospel, and that's why, Victor's book is absolutely amazing. On This Rock, a call to center the Christian response to child abuse on the words and teachings of Jesus, words and teaching of Christ, something to that effect. If you do a search for On This Rock Veith, you'll find it. Vieth. How about medical safety? We felt marginalized with, so this is what the person is writing. We have felt marginalized with the current political climate. Our children have legitimate, serious medical conditions, and it feels like the churches in our area have turned their backs on us, being labeled as living in fear, making it our problem, when in actuality, it's knowing what is legitimately unsafe. How about that? Whether it is something that applies specifically to abuse, to the intersection of the pandemic with abuse, and there's many ways that this pandemic is intersecting with and complementing and complicating abuse dynamics. Robert, you and I helped write a piece about that. How do we respond to COVID in the midst of this, and how that could impact safety?
Yeah, very loaded question, but an important question. We talked a little bit about the importance of putting people over institutions. Let's apply that to politics. Let's put people over politics. When we dehumanize anyone, when we create that other, when we create that them, and that enables us to treat them like a jerk or an enemy or evil or whatever the case may be, we're veering away from Christianity. And so that certainly intersects in a host of ways. We look at the toxicity of our current political climate. We look at the pugilism, which many Christians engage in this political climate, the aggressive posture. It's not the way of Christ. You have, and again, without going too far into the rabbit hole and creating some very interesting comments, we have mainstream political figures saying, hey, the turn the other cheek way of Christ, not really the way to go if we want to be effective in politics. And I agree. Which is more important? Which is more important, our faith or our politics? And I think when we answer that question, the answer is to love your God with all your heart, all your soul, your mind, love your neighbor as yourself. And that means treating people with respect. It means not coercing them. It means not intimidating them. It means not manipulating them, say through misapplication of gather yourselves together verses. It means loving them and prioritizing their safety, and prioritizing their psychological and their emotional well-being as well.
Cool. Last question, and we're not going to be able to give it the level of attention that it needs, but to bring it up, I think is important. How do you respond if church leadership, or even just somebody else that you're talking to in the church, sees the sexual abuse as a sin, and you were a participant in the sin?
Can you say the full question again?
If in the church leadership's mind, or in the person that you're talking to, sexual abuse is a sin, and you engaged in that sin by being the victim.
And they don't differentiate between someone who is sinning and someone who is being sinned against.
Yep. What do you do then?
If I'll say this again, I'm not trying to change the church's theology, but if I were a survivor in that circumstance and someone didn't understand that I was being sinned against, then that's an environment that I would not feel that I would stay in. I just simply couldn't. They have to understand. They don't have to, but if they can understand the difference between a child being sinned against and someone who is, sinning against, then I simply couldn't stay in that environment. That's not a safe environment for anybody.
Yeah.
I agree. I agree fully. I'll echo your one-word answer earlier, David. Leave is the short answer. And the other piece here, this is again a failure to live out Scripture, because the Bible talks about rape. Bible talks about power. It talks about sexual assault. Nathan doesn't confront Bathsheba. It confronts King David. It says, "You are the man." Bathsheba isn't cursed as a result. King David is. If you look at the dynamics surrounding, there are other sexual assaults in the Bible as well. There are clear distinctions between oppressed and oppressor. Read any of the prophets, major or minor, you will see explicitly oppressed and oppressors. This isn't modern woke adjectives. These are the words of Scripture. That compel us to care for the oppressed, to care for the vulnerable. It's at the core of our faith. If a church doesn't get that, you should find one that does.
All right. Well, we have to wrap up for. Did you have one last thing, David?
No, I just said amen.
Oh, all right. Yes, indeed. We have to wrap up for today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Robert and David, for your wisdom. Yes, thank you so much. We hope to see you all in February. In February, we're going to have Baz Chavidian and Martha, and I am sorry, but I am blanking on her name. She's a pastor in the on her last name. She's a pastor in the Lynchburg area. Will be our guest as we talk about trustworthiness and transparency. With a focus on trustworthiness, and understanding of trustworthiness is not, you have to trust me. Rather, it is, I need to act in a way that is worthy of your trust. And so we'll be talking about trustworthiness, transparency when it comes to responding to trauma and abuse in our churches. That's coming up in February. We'll have the specific date come down the pipe. Looking forward to seeing you all then. And thank you again for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week.